So we took 2 weeks to pack up our life and shut down the house, find housing, and we traveled to Nashville.
Why would a doctor recommend parents take their child to a facility to live his life in the 1980s? Is there ever a good reason to take your child out of the hospital and take him to Disney instead? How did Peg trust her gut when it came to her son needing cardiac transplantation during COVID-19? Welcome to Heart with Anna. I am Anna Jaworski and the host of your program. I'm also a heart mom to a heart warrior who is now 28 years old and was born with a single ventricle heart, just like our guest son. Today's show is Heart Mom Trusting Her Gut, and our guest is Peg Eitl. Peg Eitl is a mother to 3 children, Joe, aged 40, Jason, 36, and Lacey, 31. Joe was born with Down syndrome and a single ventricle heart. Due to his medical complexity and intellectual disability, the doctors advised Peg and her husband Craig to put him in a facility, but they would have none of it. Fortunately, they met with cardiologist Dr. Black, who encouraged them and gave them hope for Joe. Over the next few years, the new parents worked tirelessly with their son, enrolling him in early intervention therapies and extracurricular activities in between cardiac appointments and procedures, including a BT shunt at 11 months, a Modified Glenn, and a Fontan at 7 years of age. Throughout his health battles, Joe and his parents have worked together to achieve the best outcomes possible. Joe's determination to survive drove him to be the best he could be, and his parents' advocacy and pushing for the best treatment possible resulted in him being listed for a heart-liver transplant. This was an especially trying time because they had to deal with the complexities that COVID-19 required. Welcome to Heart with Anna, Peg.
Anna, thank you. It is truly an honor to be with you. I have to say, I love what you do, and I appreciate the opportunity to be a part of it.
Well, thank you so much. And I can't wait to hear what you have to share. My heart warrior is 28, and most people consider me a veteran mom, but I think you've got me beat. So let's start by finding out a little bit more about when Joe was born, because I was just heartbroken when you told me that his doctors suggested you take him to a facility.
So it was 1983, and it was a very different time. My husband and I were young. We were both healthy. And for all intents and purposes, my pregnancy was a good one. I was one of those moms that actually liked being pregnant, drove people crazy. But I didn't have all the challenges that some moms have. And we didn't know there was anything wrong until we were actually in the delivery room. When I went into labor, it was a pretty typical story. I was waiting. I was a few days late and my water broke. So they told me, call when you're in labor. Labor came on a few hours later, went to the hospital, doing everything that you're supposed to do. Nothing is really progressing. And they put me on the PIC drip. Lovely. That just pushes you right to really intense contractions. And I lived through that for hours. And they suggested a C-section. And I'm not going to lie, at this point, I truly would have allowed them to extract this child through any of my orifices. I just needed this child out.
I can totally relate to that.
Yeah, right. So it wasn't until they literally pulled this child from me. We just knew. My husband was at my side and the energy in the room just changed. They whisked him away very quickly. I heard some people talking. We were very fortunate. We were in a hospital that had a NICU. And so, off went the child. My OB was trying to reassure me, but, really didn't share much of anything. It felt like an eternity, but it was actually a few hours before somebody came in and shared with us that our son was born with Down syndrome, which is a form of mental retardation, and that he had some very complex medical challenges, not the least of which was that he had what they believed was a very serious heart condition, and they didn't expect him to live to his first birthday. And they proceeded to tell me that if he did live, there would be a whole laundry list of things that could go wrong.
That is an amazing story. And your son was born with a single ventricle heart, just like my son was born with a single ventricle heart. And we know that they weren't doing operations to save these kiddos in every hospital.
That is true.
It was very new. And there were only a couple of hospitals in the world that were working to save these kids. So it must have been terrifying for you to hear what you heard.
We didn't know that at this point. We were very fortunate because Dr. Ian Black was actually friends with the physician who headed up the NICU at the hospital that he was born in. And he called his friend who came to the hospital and spent hours listening to my son. We hadn't even seen him yet.
Oh my
They
gosh.
hadn't brought my son to me. We went hours. We kept asking the nurse, we want to see the baby. We want to see the baby. We had completely discounted this idea that he belonged in an institution. We wanted to see him. We truly needed information.
Sure.
And Dr. Black actually drew a picture of an HLHS heart.
Wow.
He nailed the anatomy. It was a pencil drawing. I still have it. It's 40 years old, but I still have that piece of paper.
I would love to see it, Peg. That's amazing.
It is an amazing story, but he's the one that gave us hope. He's the one that told us that amazing advances were being made every day. And we were fortunate that one of the hospitals that was familiar with the procedures was actually in Philadelphia. But I'll be honest, we didn't know about them until 6 years later. We had the BT shunt done, and my son was a blue baby up until that point, and actually started becoming a little bit blue again when he was about 6 years old. And that's when we were having to find a facility that was equipped to do it. We were lucky. There was one in our hometown that was able to perform the surgeries. There was a surgeon that was just arrogant enough to give us the confidence that he knew what he was doing, and we trusted the process.
And you want somebody who is, I hate to use the words arrogant enough, except, who's self-confident enough that they believe that they can help your child. You don't want a surgeon who says, well, I'm not sure. You don't want any waffling.
Exactly.
You want someone who says, oh, yeah, I can fix this kid, even if they've only fixed one other kid like it, or maybe none. Maybe your kid is the first one that they even attempted this on. But hey, at least they have the courage to do it. And that was in the early 80s. I mean, this was just coming to the forefront. I do know of a couple of people who had a BT shunt before the Norwood was invented, and they survived long enough to get a Fontan procedure or a bidirectional Glenn. But there aren't many, Peg, and I'm sure you know that.
I know.
There really aren't many.
There are times in Joe's life where we were told how lucky we were to have gotten the years we had gotten. We still feel that way now, but it's interesting. Somebody told us that when he was 11, and again when he was 15, and then when he was 19. You were given that. You're really lucky. He's really done well for as long as he has. But he's an Energizer bunny. He takes a licking and just keeps on ticking.
Well, the hard thing, I would think, because my kid was considered a pioneer, and my kid was born in the 90s, 11 years after Joe was born. And the operation was still considered pioneering at that time. It was still considered experimental. So were they able to give you any kind of prognosis?
So initially, the prognosis that we got before Dr. Black got involved was he won't see his first birthday. Dr. Black didn't guarantee the first birthday. What he guaranteed is that if there is a way, we would find it, and we would find it together. So he just gave us, he gave us the confidence. He was just a lovely man who truly did care.
Well, that's somebody who believes in what we now call family-centered care. But that was very rare back in the 80s and in the 90s. Back in the 80s and 90s, it was more like, I'm the doctor, I'm the authority, listen to me, do what I say.
Oh, and there's still some practicing like that today.
That is true. That is true. But I think that the trend is more towards this family-centered care, especially the bigger hospitals. They seem to be aware of the importance of involving the parents, the siblings, the grandparents, as many people as you can to form a tribe and to help this child who has special medical concerns to help them to thrive. And I'm very happy that over the course of my child's lifetime, I've seen this major shift in medical philosophy. Do you feel that you've seen that in your part of the country too?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And in fact, I would say we wouldn't be where we are today if it weren't for a very collaborative team that helped us get Joe through this most recent battle, which was the heart and liver transplant.
Right. And we'll be getting into that in a little bit further into the show.
Yep.
But before we do that, my heart was just bleeding for you when I realized Joe was your first child. My first child's name is also Joe. But luckily for me, my
That's
Joseph
great.
was heart healthy. So I already knew how to be a mother. You were learning everything all at once, and you were thrown into the role of being his advocate. What helped you and your husband to get through such a difficult time?
It's a great question. Well, let me start by saying I've never been one to walk away from a challenge. I am now retired, but I had a lifetime in sales. And if you told me it couldn't be done, that was the one I went after. It's just who I am. But honestly, with Joe, we fell in love at first sight. We really believe that everything happens for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
And I will share with you, there was an article written, it was actually published in the newspaper by Irma Bombeck, who is just a fabulous author. She wrote a story called The Special Mom or The Special Mother,
Mm-hmm.
I believe.
Yep. I remember
Have you read
seeing it. Yes, ma'am.
I can't tell you. That was what I needed to hear. I had already believed that everything happens for a reason and that we were given this child for a reason. But I read that and thought, okay, so I'm not as inept as I think I thought I was, right? I can do this. I'm supposed to do this. This is my destiny. This is my fate. So it was a lot of one day at a time, but always with the expectation that there would be a future.
Home Tonight Forever by the Baby Blue Sound Collective.
I think what I love so much about this CD is that some of the songs were inspired by the patients.
Many listeners will understand many of the different songs and what they've been inspired by. Our new album will be available on iTunes, Amazon.com, Spotify.
I love the fact that the proceeds from this CD are actually going to help those with congenital heart defects.
Enjoy the music.
Home Tonight Forever.
This content is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. The opinions expressed in the podcast are not those of Hearts Unite the Globe, but of the hosts and guests, and are intended to spark discussion about issues pertaining to congenital heart disease or bereavement.
You are listening to Heart with Anna. If you have a question or comment that you would like addressed on our show, please send an email to Anna Jaworski at anna@hearttoheartwithanna.com. That's anna@hearttoheartwithanna.com. Now, back to Heart with Anna.
Hey, before the break, we were talking about the early days with Joe, but now I want to talk about when he was a little bit older. We know from your bio that he had his first surgery at 11 months of age, and then he had another one at 7 years of age, his bidirectional Glenn. Can you tell us about that surgery?
Sure. The Modified Glenn was actually a very difficult surgery for Joe for a couple of reasons. The first is that they actually left a piece of a catheter inside him. And as you know, and many of your listeners probably know, this is an open heart procedure. It was the first time that my son was on a bypass machine. It was the first time that he experienced what I will call extreme pain. Prior to that, Joe was just a bubbling, happy-go-lucky child who, believe it or not, loved going to the hospital. He loved going to the doctor's office. He liked being the center of attention. And that particular procedure with some complications brought a darker side out. We saw Joe beginning to show signs of depression and not being the fighter we needed him to be.
Wow. That's scary. But see, he was old
hard.
enough at 7 to understand that this isn't where he normally was and things were being done to him that he wouldn't have chosen to have happen to him. And he was powerless. All these big people, all these adults were saying, hold still, don't move. We have to do this to you. And he really had no options.
It was pretty horrible. Again, every other experience had been positive. We were fortunate. We were at a hospital where he'd been cared for since he was a baby, and the staff hadn't changed. The x-ray technicians knew him by name. He'd been in the hospital a number of times, but never for anything like this. So this really changed his perspective about hospitals. And my fear, knowing that we had a second part of this, the Fontan, coming up, my fear was that we weren't going to get a cooperative fighter, that he was going to go into it with the wrong attitude.
Or shut down.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And I think that's a legitimate fear. And I think, unfortunately, back in the 80s, back in the 90s, they weren't really talking to us about the psychological aspect of having a congenital heart defect and having closed or open heart surgery. Their feeling, or at least my experience was, that their feeling was, hey, your kid's alive, you should be grateful. And there was no recommendation to have your child visit with Child Life, or I don't even know if every hospital had Child Life specialists back then. But
No, they certainly didn't. Although, again, we were lucky because it was a children's hospital. There were a lot of wonderful people that tried to make the experience a good one. But the complications that he experienced had us really questioning what was in his best interest at that particular time.
What kind of complications did he have?
Well, the first was that they had left a piece of a catheter inside him.
You said that at the beginning, and I'm thinking, how in the world did they do that, Peg?
Well, it happens. And
that is so scary.
It gets a little bit worse, too, because, again, my son with special needs, his communication skills were not that of a normal 7-year-old. We could understand him, but you've seen your own son go through this. He's splayed out on a hospital bed. He's got the incision down his chest and tubes and, all that coming out of him. He was a mess. After they realized that they were going to have to go back in again, and this is probably what made it so traumatic, he came out, he'd gone off the machine and extubated, and then they were taking him back in again. He was having difficulty breathing. They knew something was wrong, so they put him back in again. And when he came out of that second procedure, I mean, he just had to be mad at the world. Like, I can't believe you made me do that again.
Yeah, I get it. I think I would be mad too.
And his recovery wasn't what we thought it should be. Again, we just didn't feel like he was kind of in it with us. And the second complication is that in order to relieve his pain, they gave him some pretty heavy doses of pain medication, and at one point gave him too much. And we knew something was really wrong. They didn't. So we were saying something's not right. He wasn't responding the way he had been. He had been alert and responding to us, and then he wasn't. And he looked to me to be drugged. It took us kicking and screaming for someone to actually check to see that they had, in fact, given him too much of a very dangerous drug. And they had to kind of wait it out. So we got through that.
There was no reversal
harrowing
agent?
No. No, we had to wait it out. So they were monitoring him. It was very touch and go. It was very scary. The whole thing was just a harrowing experience.
Sure.
And so as he was beginning to get more aware and days are going by and his recovery is just not going as well as we would have expected. And they said the same thing. They thought at this point he should be able to get up and he should be able to walk. And he just didn't want to participate. That's when we made the decision to take him home. Now, full disclosure, home care wasn't what it is today, but I did work in insurance. So I knew such a thing existed. And at this point, he was out of intensive care. He needed IV therapy and he needed oxygen. But those were two things I knew could be done at the home.
Sure.
And we were approaching the holidays. And I just thought if we can get him out of this setting and give him something that makes him happy, it's going to make a world of difference. We took him home. We had the fire company brought Santa on a truck to our house. We had
Aw.
lots of people coming and visiting. And we decided at that point that we were going to take him to Disney.
I just think this is the best story, Peg. Okay. So was he still on oxygen when you decided to take him to Disney?
No, we'd actually gotten him off the oxygen. So we weaned him off the oxygen
IV?
pretty quickly.
Okay. Was he still on IV drugs?
No, as soon as we
Okay.
got him home, we actually, within a matter of about a week, we got him off of all of that. He
Oh my
really did
gosh.
thrive. He became
Yes.
happy again. He was
Yeah.
thrilled to see his siblings and to
Of
see
course.
the
His
neighbors,
own
and
room, his own bed. Yeah.
all of it just made a world of difference. So,
Sure.
and we know that we're facing this other surgery the following year,
Mhm.
and we just decided that he earned it. To be perfectly frank, we had conversations about he might not make it.
Yeah.
And he's with us now and he's okay. Let's do this. We didn't exactly have the means to just drop everything, but we made it happen with that in mind, that we're going to give him the best vacation. And honestly, if you want to go somewhere where you're going to get treated special, Disney's the place to go. We called ahead. He still had his cough pillow. I'm sure
Oh,
you're familiar with the
wow.
cough pillow.
Mhm.
The incision on his chest was still pretty raw. They had opened him twice, so he was, he was quite the mess. But they reluctantly allowed us to take him home, and then reluctantly allowed us to go to Disney. Initially, they said, that's ridiculous. You can't do that. And
Well,
when I
it's
had the
not like you were
conversation,
going to take him on the crazy roller coasters. You just wanted
Exactly.
him to see Mickey Mouse and the Chipmunks
Exactly.
and just walk around, watch the fireworks. He didn't have to do anything that was jarring to really have a wonderful time, especially at that age. They're just happy to be out of the house and see so many cool things. And I don't know if this was the case for you, but I know a lot of my friends who went to Disney way back when, they would get a special pass if they had children with special needs, and they would let those kids go to the front of the line instead of making them wait such a long time. Were you lucky enough to have that opportunity as well?
absolutely. So he was in a wheelchair, and we saw parts of Disney you're not supposed to see. They whisked him behind the scenes to get up to the
Oh,
front of
neat.
lines. And he did get his
Aw.
one-on-one with Goofy and with
Aw.
Mickey and with Minnie. And
Neat.
what we were doing throughout the whole trip was sort of reinforcing that he deserved this, that he
Mhm.
really was a warrior. He had done his part. He had fought hard. And again, from that point forward, the recovery was pretty remarkable. And we did have a willing partner at the point that it was time to do the Fontan. We'd always talked about this being a 2-part thing. In hindsight, maybe that's why he was not feeling it after the first one. But that's what we had done. We had always tried to explain to him what was going to happen, why it was happening. We still do that. I mean, he went into the transplant with a pretty clear understanding of what he was going to have to do.
Anna Jaworski has written several books to empower the congenital heart defect, or CHD, community. These books can be found at Amazon.com or at her website, www.babyheartspress.com. Her bestseller is The Heart of a Mother, an anthology of stories written by women for women in the CHD community. Anna's other books, My Brother Needs an Operation, The Heart of a Father, and Hypoplastic Left Heart Syndrome, a handbook for parents, will help you understand that you are not alone. Visit babyheartspress.com to find out more.
Heart to Heart with Anna is a presentation of Hearts Unite the Globe and is part of the Hug Podcast Network. Hearts Unite the Globe is a non-profit organization devoted to providing resources to the congenital heart defect community to uplift, empower, and enrich the lives of our community members. If you would like access to free resources pertaining to the CHD community, please visit our website at www.congenitalheartdefects.com for information about CHD, the hospitals that treat children with CHD, summer camps for CHD survivors, and much, much more.
I love how before the break we were talking about how important it is for a parent to trust her gut, and the fact that you and Craig just said, okay, Joe deserves this. Our family deserves this. We need to have this vacation. And the medical professionals were not super on board. but they did say, okay, reluctantly. And you just did it because you knew that would help Joe buy into the next procedure that he was going to need. So now let's talk about what's been happening more recently in Joe's life. In June of 2019, there was an event that completely changed his medical course. Can you tell us about that?
Absolutely. So I had brought him along on a business trip. We were gone for about 5 days. It's summer. It's hot. We came back and Joe's legs were showing signs of edema. And so we did what we've always done because we've been in heart failure before. We threw some additional diuretics at him and it didn't help. We got an appointment with the cardiologist. Cardiologist saw him, wanted him admitted. He was in the hospital more than he was out between July and January of that year. And I have to say that sadly, when the Fontan failed and there were no surgical interventions left to do, we'd already had a pacemaker, we'd already had a revision. We were just at the point where this muscle, which, as you know, was half the heart, had just had enough. This is what we were told. And on top of that, this lovely PLE reared its ugly head again.
Oh, no.
And so his decline was pretty quick. We started talking about transplant in the beginning of October, and we were going through the process. It's a very long and arduous process. And the hospital that he was at had been enthusiastic initially, which was exciting for us because as a special needs child, we'd always been told he would never have a chance at a transplant.
Really? Oh, my goodness.
Many times.
I had heard
times.
rumors of that, but that's horrible to be told that just because your kid has Down syndrome, he won't qualify. That's really, really scary.
There are efforts afoot right now to change that. And in fact, we're proof that it is possible. There are others to blaze trails before us. But it was just a really scary time because what we were being told was that his days were numbered and that he probably would not live to his birthday.
Oh.
He did live to his birthday. His birthday was January 23rd. We threw a big party for him. At that point, he was unable to walk. He was a shadow of his former self. He was pretty sick. They were trying to treat symptoms, but there was no surgical magic. And at that point, not a lot of hope for a transplant.
I imagine this was one sick young man.
Yes. I still can't go back and look at the pictures from those days. It's just too hard.
Sure.
It was a dreadful time, but we managed to get his records sent to, I believe it was 10 hospitals. There aren't a lot of hospitals around the country that do heart and liver transplants.
Right.
And my cardiologist said, you know what? We're going to send him to everyone that does.
That's great.
I know. There was only one that actually wanted to meet Joe.
Oh my gosh.
Every other one rejected sight unseen. They saw his medical records and said, not interested. There's no question Joe on paper looked very high risk, but we knew him. We knew he was a fighter, and we knew that where there's a will, there's a way. That is a saying that Joe just sort of
exemplifies.
Takes to heart like no one. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly.
Okay. He has protein-losing enteropathy. His liver has been compromised because he's had a Fontan physiology. He's in heart failure. Was the hospital that agreed to take him local, or did it require you to travel?
No, we actually, during the height of COVID, had to get in our car and drive 17 hours to Nashville, Tennessee. Vanderbilt, actually, upon meeting Joe, admitted him. And they were very upfront with us. We had no less than 15 doctors working with him.
Wow.
Trying to understand his physiology. They went back and compared all their scans to the scans that were done previously in his life. Wow. They actually were able to see that something did happen during a catheterization that was actually done to see if they could improve the circulation. And instead, without realizing it, they cut off a collateral that was actually helping to redirect blood to his lungs. So he ended up with pleural effusions that just wouldn't go away. His one lung was pretty compromised. They couldn't fix that, but they did keep him inpatient for about 4 weeks. And during that time, they learned as much about him as they could and us. And they basically said, we want to try some new medications. We want to try diet and exercise. And we want to see if we can get him stronger, because if we were to list him today, he would not survive the surgery. These surgeries go 17 to 24 hours.
Yeah.
They do the heart and then they do the liver. It's a big deal.
Sure.
We actually followed their direction. Joe was able to get on a new cocktail of medications. We took him home. He was one determined young man. When we first got home, he couldn't walk from our front door to the sidewalk without assistance, and he had to sit down when he got there. By the end of the summer, he was actually walking 10,000 steps a day. We got him off oxygen.
Wow, that's a huge difference.
Yeah, we changed his diet, went to a whole food diet, very high protein, little to no saturated fats. We were trying to make sure we got healthy fats into him. But all of these things, it was a combination of will and diet and exercise and medications that got him strong enough so that when we presented back to Vanderbilt, I don't think they thought they'd ever see us again. But we walked in and they looked at him and they started calling their colleagues. Oh my God, you got to come in here. You got to see Joe. Wait, everybody, come on in the room. We got to see Joe. Long story short, they began the process again. We stayed for about a week. We had to go through new tests. And then they sent us home and said, we'll meet next week. We'll go over the case and we'll let you know. They called us and told us that they were going to list him, that we needed to move to Nashville.
Wow.
So we took 2 weeks to pack up our life and shut down the house, find housing, and we traveled to Nashville.
Now, by this time, your other two children were also adults, so you didn't have to worry about them in school or anything, right?
Correct. And they were actually a really big help. Both of them live nearby. They both traveled to Nashville. They traveled to Nashville when we first went down to help us get settled. They came down the day that we got the call. They weren't able to go in and see him in the hospital because it was COVID, but they wanted to be nearby. And actually later in his care, my daughter was given special permission to come in and work with Joe because she has an uncanny ability to get him to do pretty much anything. And we needed that.
His own personal therapist.
And it's ironic because you talked about this earlier, that family-centered care, Vanderbilt understood that very well. Mm-hmm. They allowed both Craig and I to be part of the team when they weren't allowing visitors for other patients. They just knew that Joe wasn't going to get through this without the help of the three musketeers. So they extended that even beyond that to allow Lacey to come in and spend some time with him, which helped him in his recovery.
So how long did he have to wait before he got the heart and liver?
We were actually working on the evaluation for over a year when they finally listed him, which they didn't do until we arrived in Nashville. That was on November 2nd. And he actually got his transplant on the 24th of November.
Wow.
The day before Thanksgiving.
Amazing.
So we didn't have to wait long.
No.
We learned a lot about all this. He's a small guy, which is a good thing. If you're big, you need the heart and liver of a big person. If you're small, you can take the heart and liver of a small person or a big person. We thank God every day because Joe was fortunate to receive the gift of life from a very sad story, a 14-year-old girl who died tragically. Her family made that ultimate sacrifice, allowed us the opportunity to save Joe. Wow. So Joe is with us today. It's 2 years in November. He is probably healthier today than he's ever been in his life. He still walks 10,000 steps a day. He works out twice a week with a personal trainer. And he's just as happy as he's ever been.
That's an amazing story. I know that a lot of people believe that if you get a heart transplant, it will completely reverse the protein-losing enteropathy. Was that the case for Joe?
It was, but it took several months. For the first 6 months after the transplant, we were still struggling with a lot of those same symptoms. Joe actually had a very difficult recovery. I would say we weren't feeling like it was the right decision until we were about a year out. Mm-hmm. And we don't know that protein-losing enteropathy will never rear its ugly head again. In fact, there's so much they're just learning about the lymph system and what causes the PLE. And there are new treatments every day. So we remain hopeful that we'll never see it again because it is a very dreadful thing to deal with.
Right.
But we were told by one of the doctors when we first went down to Vanderbilt that a heart and liver transplant is like trading one chronic condition for another. Mm-hmm. And that struck me really odd, but I understand it today. So managing a transplant and trying to avoid rejection and having to deal with a lot of complications that come from the many drugs that transplant patients are on is truly still managing a chronic condition. It's just a different one. Right. And he feels a whole lot better now than he did when we were dealing with all his heart failure.
Sure. It seems as though every single family I've spoken to who has had transplantation in their lives, no matter if it's kidney or heart liver or heart and kidney, all of them say the same thing, that you're just trading one set of problems for another. But if you're lucky, after you have traded that set of problems, you're able to heal and feel better in many cases than they've ever felt in their lives. And I think that's just something that we just need to keep in the back of our minds, because I think most of us single ventricle heart moms are told from an early stage that, yes, your kid is probably going to have scheduled surgeries, but they may ultimately need a heart transplant anyway. And we're kind of prepared from an early stage that this is just like another procedure, but I think it's really different.
I remain hopeful that that will change and that they will find a way to accommodate that heart that operated differently. I hope that one day they'll be able to reverse it. There are absolutely promising things being done across the country and across the world. So maybe one day it won't require a new organ. It'll just require some replumbing, if you will.
Right. I had Dr. Timothy Nelson from HeartWorks on the program, and the research that they're doing with stem cells is very promising.
Isn't it? It's so exciting.
Oh my gosh, Peg, I keep my fingers crossed that I live long enough to see this research come to fruition, because wouldn't it be amazing if our future grandchildren or my great-great-grandchildren wouldn't have to worry about having a congenital heart defect?
I think that it's coming. Mm-hmm. And I would say, even if it's not that, there are also advances being done with transplant and experiments around transplanting organs and bringing with those organs bone marrow from the donor to the recipient. There's hope that we won't need to be on anti-rejection drugs for the rest of our life. And many of the complications that transplant patients have come from the very toxic drugs that you need to take to keep your body from rejecting those organs. So right. I see advances all around.
Yeah.
It is exciting.
Oh my goodness, this is the first time for me to hear about the bone marrow possibly also being transplanted. That's brilliant. I've never heard of that.
So wish I had known that before Joe got it. I would have been pushing for him to be on the cutting edge of that. But
sure,
I see that in the future.
I think there are so many things coming down the pike, and that's what I love about this podcast is it gives me a chance to talk to people like you and to doctors and researchers and find out what's going on, because I'm not a doctor. I'm just a mom, but I'm a mom who really cares a lot and who has a lot of friends in the heart world. And I want to know about these things because I want everybody to know everything that they can to have the best chance for survival.
And I just love that your podcast and the wealth of information available on the internet today make it possible for young moms to truly study. It wasn't easy to get my hands on information early on when PLE first reared its ugly head. Mm-hmm. Most doctors didn't know what it was.
Right. So, there are still a lot of doctors who don't know what it is. And it's a really, really scary illness. How old was Joe when he first acquired it?
I want to say he was about 17 when we first started seeing symptoms. And at that point, we were able to, again, manage through diet. Mm-hmm. We added MCT oil to his diet because I had read something about that. My mother was a librarian, so she sort of helped me get access to information that wasn't at the ready the way it is today. And they also did some surgical interventions. we were able to improve the function, the cardiac function, which put PLE into remission. But it reared its ugly head a couple of times again during his lifetime. And again, almost took his life in this most recent go around.
Yeah. That's what's so scary about PLE. And I've actually had some friends whose children have died from it. And it's just heartbreaking because they didn't die from their heart defect, but we all believe that that was just a complication from having the heart defect. And it's just heartbreaking. But they do know so much more today. And so for those of you friends who are listening, who do have children with PLE, don't despair because there is much more being done today for children who have PLE. And there are centers across the world who are trying new technologies, new advances. Don't despair. I've done several shows with people who have survived PLE just like Joe. And I want to encourage you, don't give up. They can survive. Peg, I can't believe our time is up already. It has just gone by so fast, but this has been so informative. Thank you so much for coming on the program today.
Oh, no, thank you. If my message can reach anyone, one person who's doubted themselves, that inner voice saying, I'm not a doctor, they must know better than me. There is a maternal instinct that we all have, and no one knows our child like we do. So you've got to go with your gut. You've got to challenge people when it's appropriate. Don't be afraid to do things differently or to ask new people to get involved so that you've got a fresh set of eyes.
And don't be afraid to go to Disney.
Hey, if that's the right thing at the right time, absolutely.
Yes. I mean, we really do have to know what motivates our kids and get our kids to buy in on their own treatment and their own therapies. And really, Disney was part of your therapy for Joe and for the whole family.
It absolutely was.
Yeah,
it was.
I think it was
healing.
I think it was brilliant. I think you all deserved it. And I'm so glad that Disney treated you royally like they should have. I mean, it sounds like it was a fantastic experience for you. And everyone who probably saw you was probably inspired. So thank you for sharing that amazing story. Well, friends, that does conclude this episode of Heart to Heart with Anna. Thanks for listening today. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider leaving a review of our program on whatever platform you use to listen to the podcast. It really helps other parents to know what our program is about because sometimes people see Heart to Heart with Anna and they think it's a relationship program, and it is. It's a relationship in the congenital heart defect community. So please let people know about our messages of hope and healing. Have a great day, my friends, and remember, you are not alone.
Thank you again for joining us this week. We hope you have become inspired and empowered to become an advocate for the congenital heart community. Heart to Heart with Anna with your host, Anna Jaworski, can be heard at any time wherever you get your podcasts. A new episode is released every Tuesday from noon Eastern Time.